Hello and welcome to Conversations on Climate. My name is Chris Caldwell and this series is produced by United Renewables in collaboration with the London Business School Alumni Energy Club. We're recording today from the London Business School. We're inside a lecture hall where we've just had a great conversation with Professor Jean-Pierre Benoît, who's the chair of the economics department here, professor of economics, and one of the world's leading experts in the field of game theory. We covered a lot of ground, starting from where Professor Benoît's interest in game theory came from, how the whole field of economics has developed over the 30-odd years he's been studying it, including where behavioral economics fits the matrix of economic thinking. And we then went into more detailed questions of rational polarization, which is the idea that two people can be presented with the same information but come up with entirely different viewpoints on it, and both be right. It was a remarkable conversation with a remarkable individual, and I really do hope that you enjoy it. He has a natural charisma and a gift for storytelling. Professor Benoît, thank you so much for taking the time to come in and speak to us. It's a great honor and a great privilege.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, you've got a great passion for maths, and you've got a great passion for trying to understand human behavior through maths. Could you explain how you got into economics and how your passion for game theory, where it originated from?
Well, when you speak of a passion for maths, I think I have a passion for logical thinking, let me put it that way, and careful thinking. And of course, economics has vast application to all kinds of problems and solutions, and for society is a very important subject. But what I appreciated in economics, at least the kind of economics that I do, is that a mathematical approach. But by mathematical approach, again, I would emphasize not so much fancy mathematics, but just a very carefully laid out reasoning, and very logical step by step, where you can go and say, that's what I assumed. Was that a good assumption? Was that not a good assumption? This is what seems to follow. Does it really follow? Does it not follow? So that's the kind of thinking that I like, very precise thinking, let's say.
Where did that kind of passion come from? What really kind of got you into game theory originally, which is the area of economics you're best known for?
Yeah, so game theory, and there's something called decision theory, which looks at how people take decisions, if you like, and then game theory is to some extent interpersonal decision theory, or interdependent decision theory, decisions when lots of people are taking decisions, And if you think about it, I might say, like, everything is game theory. That might be a bit of an exaggeration, but nonetheless, it's true that there's just a range of phenomena that you can analyze through that lens, even if you don't think of it at first, So I could look at auctions, might be a very obvious one, how you auction, but I've also looked at immigration policy, in the implications of immigration policy. So it's just a very useful systematic lens for analyzing a range of phenomena. Blue wall of silence, so there's just a whole range.
Now, you're chair of the economics team here. What changes have you seen in the kind of the field of economics? Been at London Business School for 16 years as well. What changes have you seen in the field of economics over that time? I suppose the obvious example would be the growing evolution and importance of behavioral economics, economic thinking, and in the way that economics presented in the press.
Yeah, so I think you've hit on a good one, actually. When I started studying, maybe game theory was the hot topic as well, and now, changes we've seen in behavioral economics, let me come back to that in a second, and maybe a change among the students is a greater interest in social issues and issues such as discrimination, climate change, very pressing topics. So we're putting those more and more into the curriculum, because not only does it interest students, but of course it's just interesting or important that people analyze that. Behavioral economics has made a big impact, maybe not completely uncontroversial impact, but it's certainly shifted, and just loosely speaking, we could say that's introducing more nuanced view of a human being, let's say, than very rational self-interest, and looking at that more carefully. But some of my work, you mentioned, looks at phenomena and challenges the interpretation. So some of it looks at supposedly behavioral phenomena and questions whether that's really what's going on.
Yeah, the fundamental premise of economics is that people are in some way rational. They somehow act in their best interest. I'm not sure that's always entirely true.
Yeah, it's certainly not always entirely true, and behavioral economics has pushed that a lot. At the same time, what we might call traditional economics didn't view it as entirely true. The question was really, is it true enough? As a good starting point for analyzing behavior. So should I start from that premise, see how far that takes me, So I think even before behavioral economics, many economists, certainly myself, wouldn't try to push too hard. Everyone's rational, just because that's the model I just gave you. It's just that's a good starting point. Let's look at deviations. Okay. But behavioral economics has emphasized more that, well, maybe you should consider deviations a bit more seriously. And I think that's a good point.
Do you think that we're living in a less rational time than before, or is our meme coins just tulips from the good old days? There seems to be a perception in the press that we're not as that we've gone off the edge of a cliff, and everybody's lost their minds, and people are doing things which are completely contrary to their own interests. Do you think that's true, or is it just a product of media?
So it would be hard to say that people are more irrational than they used to be. I doubt that's true. I haven't really studied it, and that question in that form. To answer that question, I first have to understand, what do I mean for someone to be rational? What do I mean for them to be irrational?
Excellent point.
Okay. What's the evidence that I would look at? When you say tulips, and I guess you're thinking about tulip peaks, auctions and stuff. So is that rational or is it irrational? Okay. And it certainly has a degree of both in it. But there's a lot of phenomena that look irrational aren't necessarily irrational. So from that point of view, I would just say, let's step back. Part of what, of course, when you're in the time, things look crazier than if you take a big perspective, But, so part of my work, and again, it comes from a rational tradition. It's not that I want to push rational, but part of it does look at phenomena which are apparently irrational and questions that. So if I can give you an example.
Of course.
There's something called the better than average effect. Maybe you've heard about that, right? So I bring people into a room and I say, do you think you're a safer driver than most people? Let's say less likely to cause an accident. Okay? And 80% of the people say yes. Okay? So most people think they're better drivers than most people. Okay? And there's a lot of studies like this. They don't all show that. Some show that, but there are a lot of studies like that. It's so-called better than average effect. And people say that, okay, that proves people are irrational. They're overconfident. Okay? But then I have a paper with my co-author Juan Dubra that says, well, let's be a little bit more careful. Okay? So if you want to say that shows people are irrational, that they're overconfident, first I have to define exactly what I mean by overconfident. Then I have to define exactly what I mean when I say, I think I'm a better driver. I'm sure I'm a better driver, I'm 70%, so exactly, okay? And if you define all those terms very carefully, you'll see that the fact that 80% of the people say, I think I'm a safer driver than the average, doesn't mean they're overconfident, okay? They could be perfectly rational. So that better than average effect, and it's maybe surprising, okay, but it's perfectly consistent with everybody being rational, nobody being overconfident. By rational, I mean using all the information at hand in the mathematically correct way, even being too rational. Okay? So there are a lot of phenomena like that which people, and that's quoted constantly as proof that people are overconfident, but it just doesn't show it. It really doesn't show anything at all.
Just for my own curiosity, is there a difference between male and female in that question? I don't think I know a single man who would say they're a bad driver.
You better ask, So there are sometimes depends on the question and what you're doing. You can see gender differences, you know.
All right, well, that kind of brings us neatly on to rational polarization, which is another big topic for discussion today. You wrote an article a few years back on the nightmare that it is of having the climate denier coming across for Christmas dinner. Could you explain climate skepticism in the frame of rational polarization?
Yeah. So what do I mean by rational polarization? Again, I mean, well, could it be that we're disagreeing or getting, disagreeing more and more without it being the case, well, that just one of us is stupid and the other one is smart, or rational. Now, first of all, if we bring up climate change, even though there is disagreement, I would point out that if I compare to 20, 30 years ago, there's a lot less disagreement, okay? And we sometimes forget that, and as you go into the path. So we're actually moving to convergence on the issue of climate change, much more than the opposite. But let me just take that, okay? So in fact, I just saw an article, I think it was in the BBC website, talking about oil companies hiring PR agencies and funding scientists to spread climate disinformation, let's say, okay? And to cast doubt on whether humans are responsible for warming and to exaggerate the degree to which there's disagreement, okay? And part of the point of the article is that could explain why we are where we are, so many people disagreeing. Okay, whereas if they hadn't done that, there would be even more agreement than there is. Okay? So now, if I say that to you and you're a believer in climate change, and you say, yeah, okay, that all makes sense. I understand that. Now I might speak to a skeptic who says, but you know what? All these people who disagree, it's because they don't like oil. Okay, and they're actually captured by the renewable industry, who's paying for a lot of the research. Okay, so there are a lot of vested interests on that side. Okay, so now this is really just the symmetrical argument. So if the argument that people have paid scientists to have, criticize oil is a valid one, well, how about not to criticize, to defend oil, to criticize climate change is a valid one. Well, why isn't the other argument a valid one? Mm-hmm. Okay, so therefore I have to, in that sense, step back and say, well, wait a second, on the face of it, it's not that this argument is more, I've agreed, right? My starting point was scientists can be bought. And PR can be bought, you see? So there I'll say, maybe there's a rational polarization. We'll have to really start the discussion there. Who do we think can be bought? Why is this being bought more plausible than that? You see? So there's a different way of looking at it.
But now I could be going into sharing my own personal views on this and the asymmetry of the asymmetry and organization and wealth on one side, and the relative lack of organization or relative lack of wealth on the other. Like the oil and gas industry for centuries, including the petrochemical companies and the states, have been a very, excuse the pun, well-oiled machine. They've been very, very good at it. And on the other side, you've had a lot of people who've been at heart very well-meaning, but not the industrial behemoth on the other side. There has been an asymmetry of weaponry, and it's improving, so things are more counterbalanced, more balanced, but over history, I think it's my own view is not.
Let me push back for a second. And I'm not pushing back because I don't believe climate change is man-made. I certainly do.
Yeah.
And I believe we're on the precipice of a disaster. Okay. But nonetheless, let me push back.
Please.
And say, yes, if I do a poll, I can see scientists, let's see, in the United States tend to be more left-wing than right-wing. Okay.
Scientists.
They're probably, that's what the surveys tend to indicate. They're probably not big fans of oil. Okay. So it probably doesn't take that much for them to have a distorted view, and maybe even though there's a long history of oil, the renewables are just catching up, and actually some of them have a lot of money, So maybe it's not as clear-cut as what you want. But the point I really want to make is, you see, now we're having a kind of discussion which sounds maybe more promising. Mm-hmm. Than just putting on a graph again about here's the time and here's this and this, because now you might say, yeah, that might be true. And then if you tell me, well, they're more funded, I say, yeah, you got a point, they are well funded. Okay, that's hard to disagree with. And now we're going down, you see now a different path, and maybe a more promising path. But I don't know, but it's just changed the tenor of the discussion, and it's acknowledged that it's not necessarily, when I'm denying it, that I'm just an idiot who refuses to listen to anything. Because let's face it, I believe the science, but when I say I believe the science, it's not because I've done the science. It's really hard to do the science. It's really because I believe the scientists. So now you have to ask people, why do you believe the scientists? And which scientists do you believe? And why do you believe this outlier scientist? And so again, you see it's a bit more complicated.
Yeah, a deeply polarized world is not a very happy place. That's not where you want to be. But no, another kind of good example of rational polarization might be the current energy crisis, where you've got like a big spike in all of our gas bills. And you got one side of the argument saying, well, that's because you green fools, we're not investing in the infrastructure that we need to be keeping our oil and gas networks going up. And you got the green guys going, you fools, why didn't you put more money into insulation and into more renewable energy? Both of them take the same single fact of being oil prices are high, gas prices are high, and they come to completely different conclusions on it.
Yeah, so you're basically telling me they're coming to different conclusions on what to do about it. Right? Should we invest in renewables or should we invest in fossil fuels? All right, so let's just be careful and step back a little bit. So when I speak of the polarization, I could mean polarization in our beliefs or understanding of the facts, or a polarization in what I want to do about it. All right, so the example you've given me, I would say, is put more heavily on what do I want to do about it. In fact, both groups might agree that if I'm an environmentalist, I would say, yeah, if you invested more in fossil fuel, I guess there'd be more fossil fuel. And if I'm a fossil fuel person, I'd say, okay, yeah, I guess if we put 5 times more in renewables, there'd be more renewables. So I'm not sure they're really disagreeing on that basic fact. What they're disagreeing about is what's the better route to take. See, so that's already a different kind of disagreement. So there, when I speak of careful thought, and if I just speak of polarization, of course, in the press could mean a lot of things, and if I'm going to be an academic, then I'll have to exactly define what I meant by it, and where it looks rational, where it doesn't look rational. But polarization on what we should do about it is different than on our beliefs about what's the underlying cause. And interestingly enough, your example, and we'd have to flesh out exactly what you meant by the example, but on the face of it, it's consistent with everyone agreeing completely on the cause and even possible solutions, and just disagreeing on which they prefer. Mm-hmm. Now, might be irrational is maybe the fossil fuel person will say renewables are just too far from being that, and the renewable person will say, no, you're wrong on that, right? And then if they're using confirmation bias and refusing to look at the data, that's what I might call the irrational part. Okay, so there's probably some of that in there, but a lot of it is just, no, you know what, I want to feed my family for the next 50 years, and maybe in 100 years there'll be another solution and something else is going on.
For sure. And to try and kind of break through kind of this rational polarization, you suggested that novelty, just new information that can't be looked at in the frame of your current biases and your current thinking, might be a way through it. In the climate sphere, there's a general call of, well, facts aren't working anymore. We keep on coming up with facts, and minds aren't changing because of new facts. How do you think novelty as a concept can kind of fit into that?
Yeah, so when we say facts aren't working anymore, right? So part of the problem is I just keep giving you the same kind of facts. Look at the temperature, look at this, and look how much, people are driving cars in this. And then it's almost like, well, it didn't convince me before. Why do you think it's going to convince me now? Okay, and it convinced you, it didn't convince me. Again, I'm not using actually me. Okay, yeah. But nonetheless, okay. So if you just keep pushing the same fact, then why are you surprised? And you say, you idiot. I'm saying, if you just repeated the same thing 7 times in a different way and you're surprised that I'm not convinced. So now what you might need to do is take a different angle. In fact, we had a little bit of it in our vested discussion of a different angle. So you could see somehow we both agree that you might be able to buy off people. There's something called vested interest. Okay, so now maybe we should look at that, because now you gave me a different angle. Yeah, but you say, the scientists you think are making a lot of money by the renewables, they're actually not making a lot of money. Most of them have tenure and then a school, and the interest you see. So maybe that's going to convince me more. If I look at climate change, so one thing is that I plot the temperature, I plot what that people are doing, and some skeptics will say, "But I just don't believe that it's due to what humans are doing. That's just a small factor. I don't believe that." Okay, so maybe an argument I could have is, let's just look in general, how much does the actions of mankind affect the environment, apart from climate, And maybe we could say, there's been a huge effect on the whale population. I don't know, I'm just making something up, And maybe if we get that angle, we could then first agree, is it plausible that humans would have an effect or not? And then take it that route. Okay, so not just the same kind of argument. It's almost, when I phrase it that way, you see, it almost sounds silly to think the same kind of argument repeated over and over is going to result in a different.
It does, but there is new information. Like, for example, we hit like 41 degrees here in London. That's new. That's a record. But it's a record, so therefore it's new. But if you have a look at kind of one media outlet or another, like if say you were looking at, if I was in the US and I asked Tucker Carlson on Fox News, or I asked Greta Thunberg or Al Gore, you end up with entirely different answers on this. It's a new data point. But if I was like a good conservative, I'd go and see what Tucker Carlson said. If I was a good progressive, I'd see what Al Gore says. And that would frame my belief system in and around it. How do you break through that circle?
Yeah. So first, you told me that's a new data point, that's a record, right? So what if I told you, but you know what, actually in 1974, the old record was in 1974, where, I just made that up. And 41 is a new record, but actually it was 40 in 1974, and then temperature went down. Okay, so again, you're probably going to hesitate because you haven't checked 1974, and even if what I've said is correct, you're probably not going to go, well, I changed my mind completely.
That's all fine, yeah.
All right, so I'm saying it's more complex because actually the science is we just toss this out, but the correct data, that we need to understand is very complex, and that's where the trust comes in, and understanding who I need to believe to some extent. Now, you're right, I go listen to Tucker Carlson, and then I just listen to, and I don't want to suggest that Tucker Carlson is actually giving me plausible things, he's not, but I then need to look at, on the other hand, I don't want to suggest that everyone who goes to look at him is an idiot. They're not, So they have other reasons for looking at them. So that's a problem. That's a problem, So there's a problem on who I choose to believe and why I choose to believe them. I would say the bias, the confirmation bias, is when I just choose to believe people because I want to believe their conclusions, because I like it. But then what might sound like confirmation bias, but really isn't, is, when you say something that I already believe, I tend to think you're probably right. That's not really confirmation bias because that is consistent with what I'm thinking, and it can be hard to disentangle those.
The way I looked at that was in kind of a game theory type of frame, where people are looking for their position because they're part of a group. And there's benefits of being part of that group. If you can understand the position of the group, you can be a better member, a better contributor. You can be a better conservative, or a better progressive, or whatever it might be. And that's there's personal benefits to you. And even if the facts aren't, and even if you might even know that the facts aren't really right, it doesn't matter, because the benefits of the rational decision is what you get from being a part of the group. And almost irrelevant of whether the facts are really 100% correct or not. You understand there's a bias, but you lean into that bias because being part of this group is to your benefit.
Yeah, I think that's a good analysis of some things that happen. If I look at climate change, of course, if I care about my grandchildren, then I'll say there's a lot of cost if I'm wrong about climate change. There's a lot of costs.
Not to you.
No, so that's a question.
Yeah.
So that's a question who I'm caring about. You know? But if we look at COVID, there's a lot of cost not getting a vaccine. To me personally, the chance of dying is much, much greater. But you're right, there's a cost to being the only one in my group that has the vaccine and being ostracized from them, right? And so now it's It's more complicated. Why would that group believe that? What are the other underlying things? Why am I going to view all those? And then when I put in the word, is it rational? Is it irrational? Does it matter if it's rational, or does it matter if it's irrational? So those are all, maybe I just want to emphasize here, they're all more complicated than it might look like at first.
I was lucky enough to be at the Royal Geographic Society to hear your TEDx talk in person. Great talk, and we'll include the link in the description for anyone else who wants to go and have a look at it. But could you explain what, like the first step, what is a rational accident?
Yeah, so let's just think of some accidents. Okay, so the BP Gulf oil spill, or the space shuttle exploding, or rogue traders, which I might call an accident in the sense of broadly of just a wrong thing occurring. Okay? Or a doctor is administering the wrong medication, So we could just think of all these things, 3 Mile Islands, lots of things. Okay? And a typical analysis would say, okay, well, so what went wrong? So is it that the company is prioritizing profits over safety? Okay? Is it that the workers just don't care, or they're lazy, or they're distracted, or something like that? Okay? Let me fix the errors that were made, okay? And that's what we might call, let me call an irrational accident, or just an accident. So what do I mean by irrational accident? I mean, it is possible that actually the workers are doing everything right, okay? And we'll come back to what I mean by that. And they actually care. It's not that they're lazy, and they care about the accident. Everything is right, but somehow when it's right, it's like individually it's the right thing for me to do. But when we all individually do the right thing, it's the wrong thing. Okay? If we all coordinated it, it would be the wrong thing. Okay? So let me just give an example. Not exactly an accident, but maybe this has happened to you. You have a meeting, at your company, and there are 15 of you, and you're going to make a decision, maybe hire someone, I don't know, and there's a 20-page memo you're supposed to read. It's long. Okay? So you get there, you read it, you've read it, you're ready to prepare, and then people start to talk, and you know what? All the points you're going to make, 4 other people have made them already. Okay? But why did I waste my time reading that memo? I mean, I could have been better off not reading the memo. Now, actually, I said I could have been better off, but that's not what I mean. I don't mean that like I could have been out clubbing instead, or watching TV, or having dinner with my wife. Okay? Suppose now I'm a good worker. Okay? What I think is I could have done something better for the company. That's a better use of my time. You see? It's not like I'm making a mistake. It is literally was a better use of my time not to read those memos. Okay? But the problem is when we all think that way, nobody reads the memo. Okay? And now we're going to say, well, wait a second, we were all trying to do the bad thing. There's, in some sense, and I'll come back to that again, nothing was done wrong. Okay? Now, if I look at accident reporting, okay, the shuttle, chemical plants, and a lot of things, and you see careful analyses, you'll often hear this phrase, it was an accident waiting to happen. And what does that mean, it was an accident waiting to happen? Well, there were all these procedures that should have been followed, and half of them weren't followed. Okay? And if I look at a chemical plant, so chemical plant spews deadly chemicals, it's not because someone came in and flipped the wrong switch. No, they're not that stupid. They're like 7 different safety things, There's an alarm that should go off, and there's a heating blanket, and someone should be checking the temperature gauge, and this and this and this and this. There's a lot of things that need to go wrong, okay? But then you look and you see, you know what? A lot of them weren't being followed. Okay, I look at the space shuttle, there's a very definite procedure, safety, they weren't being followed, okay? And then I go, why not? Okay. Well, now I'll come back to the memo, and I go, yeah, you know what? They should all be followed, but actually, this one doesn't need to be followed if the others are being followed. Okay? And in the sense, there's a lot of redundancy built in there, but the redundancy itself, which makes it safer, makes me not really need to put in the effort. In the sense, again, for the company, that I could be doing something else to make the company safer than being the 14th person to check something that's been checked 13 times, okay? Like too many redundancies are working against us. That's since it's a rational accident. Now, if I follow the reasoning I just gave you, I'd say, oh, I think everyone else is going to read the memo, so I won't read the memo. But everyone thinks that. So if I'm really rational, I should say, but wait a second, everyone thinks that. So maybe I should read the memo. But maybe everyone thinks that everyone reads it, so maybe I shouldn't read the memo. But maybe I should read the memo. Okay, so now it's actually more complicated. Now I'll need game theory, which you mentioned before. If I write it all out very careful, the game theory, I'll see, yes, you know what? The result could be we're all doing the right thing. We all care about safety. We all care about everything. and yet we're getting the accident. So that's what I'm calling the rational accident. For instance, you've put in more redundancy than you should when you factor in that people are going to think, should I read the memo or not?
And can you see any parallels with that with climate change?
Yeah, so I'll give you a parallel and a non-parallel. Okay, so part of what I've said is kind of like what's called a free rider problem, right? Why should I read the memo when you've read the memo? Okay, and if I look at climate change, one of the things that makes it very difficult is we know we all have to reduce. We all have to reduce. But actually, if everyone else reduces, then I don't really need to reduce. You know, even the United States, as big as it is, if all the other countries really went down and the United States went down just a little bit, maybe that would be good enough. You know, so that's like a free rider problem. What I'd like to do is do less and let you worry about it. Okay, there's the cost are being placed on everybody else, and I'm going to ignore that. Okay, and that really drives climate change a lot. That's a lot of the problem, because we can have all the discussions, and in the end, I kind of want to walk away and say, you know, my oil well is fine. You know, let somebody else take care of the problem, and then we're screwed when everyone thinks that way. It's not a change in the parallel. Is that part of the problem is I'm not really worried about you being hurt, just me being hurt, and that maybe aggravates it even more. Whereas in the rational accident, even if I am worried about you being hurt, that's not the problem. It's not that I'm not worried. I really don't want the chemical plant to explode. It's just there's that element of the free rider problem, is that I should reduce it because someone else is doing it. But there isn't, on the climate change has that. And on top of that, well, do I really care what's happening to those countries? You know, sometimes people advocate for climate change and say, you know what, you better care, because if you're worried about immigrants now, what do you think is going to happen when the water goes up, you know, and half the planet is unlivable?
Do you think that democracy is up to the task, or our current systems are up to the task of getting through this? It is so much more in the interest of the smaller nations, particularly the smaller island nations, that they desperately need this to happen. This change 100% needs to happen for these. And it's less of an issue for the massively wealthy countries, who could be spending money on building dams and stopping sea levels rising around their particular cities.
So one difficulty is, you know, and I said we're moving in the right direction, right? But one difficulty is the scientists tell us we're not kind of moving fast enough, you know, and that makes these kind of problems more urgent. It's like we don't really have 80 years to move in the right direction, you know, and we saw that problem with COVID a lot, you know. There are exponential growth, and you just look at last week we were okay. You know, we don't really need to do anything. Oh, we were just a little bit bad. A little bit bad last week means disaster this week, and super disaster next week, right? So to that extent, I really have to depend on the experts, so to speak. Right? And I really have to go with what they're saying. And if by democracy you mean just really count on people making an evaluation on their own and, you know, having a plebiscite on doing that, that's not really going to work, you know. But on the other hand, you know, the populations are moving more to let's do something about it. You know, so I don't know that a dictatorship's going to do a better job, but it's the kind of situation where, yeah, we can't just wait 40 years for everybody to realize the problem. Then it's too late.
So you seem to spend a lot of time thinking about the costs of misplaced certainties. We live in a very uncertain time. I think we live in a lot more uncertain time than we did even a year ago, and certainly before the pandemic. I think we've got an awful lot more uncertainties in our heads. I think everyone's a little bit more distracted than they were because of stuff that's happening. And obviously looking forward, there's a lot of uncertainty in climate change. You know, are we going to find this great panacea, this great solution to the problem? We think things will be bad, but we don't really know how bad. How do we deal with, you know, the uncertainty? Do we just embrace it? Do we just roll with it?
So uncertainty is really tough. It's really tough to understand, to interpret correctly, and to know what to do in the face of uncertainty, and to evaluate things, you know, and decisions, given that there was uncertainty before the decision, uncertainty after the decision. Okay, and A lot of mistakes are made that way, and a lot of wrong interpretations, okay? And maybe even sometimes professional statisticians misspeak, okay? And one thing I have in mind is, before Trump was elected, okay, and you looked at the polls, you know, and they said Hillary Clinton would be elected. But actually, what did a careful person say? Like, she has an 80% chance of being elected, you know? And I remember actually the day before, the last poll said like 70% chance, you know? And I went to the office and I went, folks, have you seen that? There's a 30% chance Trump will be elected. That's huge, you know? And when I say the statisticians made a mistake, what I mean is that after the election, a lot of them said, well, where did we go wrong? Where did we go wrong? But I say, but what do you mean went wrong? 20% is big. You know, if I say there's an 80% chance she's elected and she's not elected, I didn't go wrong. I didn't say 100. I didn't say 99.1. Okay, so they're kind of wrong in their saying they were wrong. At least if that was it. So that's one problem we have, is we tend to interpret whatever is leaning towards like to certainty. You know, the weather forecaster says 20% chance of rain. Oh, it's not going to rain. That's not what they said. You know, 1 out of 5 chance is a really big chance. Okay? So that's one error that we make. Okay? And we're not certain how to then evaluate if the person was good or bad. And we go, well, last time you said there would be a problem and there wasn't. But no, I didn't say there would be a problem. I said there's 60% chance or a 40% chance. That's a very different statement. Okay? Another way we have a problem is when we have a small chance of a very bad outcome. Okay? So there I see if someone goes, oh, I don't know, you're exaggerating climate change. There's only a 20% chance. And I go, a 20% chance the planet will be destroyed? That's huge. Okay, you can't focus on the 20%. You have to focus on put that together. But we're not very good at doing that. You know, so that all makes it very, very difficult. You say it might happen, it might not. Then you're really not sure what to do, and you really want someone to give you advice. This will happen, that won't happen. This is the right thing, sort of before the fact and after the fact. You know, and that's not going to be the case, okay? And it makes all the decisions a lot worse, okay, in lots of ways. Okay? So let me give another example. I don't know if you remember Hurricane Katrina.
Of course.
Right, so, you know, wiped out New Orleans, okay? And there was woefully inadequate preparation, okay? And this kind of motivation for one of my papers, you know? And they say, well, why? Why did the government not prepare? What does he say? So it's like a Category 5 hurricane. And if I look and I do the math, and if I look at a president's term, and I say, well, what was the chance a Category 5 hurricane would strike within that term? Something like even 2 terms, something like 5%, if I remember correctly. So that's really low. But it's a real disaster. It's not low meaning you shouldn't prepare. It's low meaning you should prepare, but it's low meaning that if I do prepare, and I come up for election and say, well, don't worry, I spent a lot of money preparing for a hurricane. They go, hurricane? There's no hurricane. What kind of an idiot are you? Okay. And the opponent who comes says, don't worry about it. Who's looking right? The person who said, don't worry about it, or the person who said, worry about it? You know, and that makes our decision making very bad. If I look at COVID and the pandemic, it's not that there were no warnings, there were tons of warnings. There are tons of warnings, okay? But the warning wasn't, well, in the next 4 years, this is a pandemic, it's stretched over time and there's a long decision. And if there are 2 candidates running and one says, we really got to prepare for the pandemic, and the other says, no, we don't, just don't listen to those guys, who's going to look right? The guy who said, no, we don't, until we did, and we didn't prepare, you know? But that uncertainty and the combination of how certain is it with how bad is it going to be leads to really bad decision making.
Yeah, which is unfortunately where our politics is at right now.
Yeah.
Nobody looks, everyone promises everything and delivers on very little. It's quite a disturbing time, actually, to be honest.
It is, and what's disturbing too is a lack of accountability, which is, if you speak about democracy, which we really need, you know. So whatever you think of Boris Johnson, let's say, what drives me crazy is when he says, well, I got all the big decisions right. But you sent sick people into care homes. Was that a right decision? How can it be right unless those people don't count it? I don't know. Explain to me. So just what's worrisome to me is you could just make that statement. Better, I'd be happier if he said, I got most of the decisions right. That wasn't the right decision. Maybe it's not as bad as you think, because if I look, I don't know, give me some explanation for why you're doing that. But if you can get away with just making that claim, and it's irrespective of what we think of him, that's worrisome. That gets more worrisome. If I look, again, Trump on COVID, if that doesn't impact you, those statements, then we're in big trouble, because the one thing that democracy is supposed to do for us is at least hold the politicians accountable and say, okay, you didn't get that right. That's not right. Let me find somebody else.
Yeah. In all these big issues that we're talking about, and be it climate change, be it democracy's issues in dealing with things, but particularly around polarization. They're all very human issues, but you've lived in kind of North and South America, you've lived in Africa, you've lived in Europe. Do you see there being big cultural differences in the way people look at it, or are we all human?
Well, I think both are true, and it's interesting if I look at like behavioral economics, not necessarily behavioral, but if I look at what is the role that culture play, okay? And maybe 30 years ago, economists would ignore that completely, more or less, not completely, Now there's a lot more work on the culture and history making a difference. But on the other hand, there might be still an inclination of a lot of economists, myself included, to say, well, before I go to the fully cultural route, let me step back and see how much are the different prices in the country affecting something? How much are the actual different conditions? How much would you actually be behaving in the same way if the institutions were the same, So there's a lot of commonality driving that, on the face of it, the first thing a game theory model would do is like abstract away from all those differences, and see how much I could explain just by using the same model, and that would be my inclination, but I wouldn't push it too much in the sense that next step should be, okay, let me take a step forward and say, well, you know what, the culture matters, partly in what you were describing before. I have to live in a society with other people who, have this way of doing things for whatever reason, and it might be possible that if our society also had that way of doing things, we'd react, but we don't, okay? And that needs to be my starting point. That's what I need to move from, how people are going to react to that. So that certainly can't be ignored.
Let's kind of go back a little bit, because we're talking about you want to believe in experts. And because you need to believe in experts because you can't do all the study yourself, which makes perfect sense. One really interesting part of your paper was talking about if you are, the more bought in you are, so the more of an expert you are, the more likely you are to be polarized. And we have been relying on experts to be telling us stuff, but those experts are polarized people, or more likely to be polarized.
So it's not exactly that, but let me first take the first part of what you said, okay, which is that we want to believe in experts.
Yeah.
Okay, and then I said you should believe in experts. And then we have, a lot of people say, well, who cares about the experts? I don't believe the experts. Okay, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? Okay, so first of all, we need the experts to be believable. Okay, so part of the problem, and they say, well, why don't people believe in experts, or they believing less? And I say, well, part of the problem is the experts themselves. Okay. So the experts they want to have a TED Talk. You mentioned I have a TED Talk, but you know what? I hate TED Talks, even though I have them. I have one. Okay, and what I hate about TED Talk is that you typically have someone come in and they go, let me show you something and make a point, boom, 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 like 20 minutes of all the data shows this, and it doesn't all show that. It's not even close. Okay, it just makes a very compelling story. And some of these are not experts, some of them are experts. There's like an incentive to try to sell my stuff. And I don't sell my stuff by sort of getting on, well, maybe this is true, maybe that's true, and here's a footnote, and this is what I did, so I have to push it, or I don't know if I have to, because I try not to, but that's the problem. The experts sometimes they don't deserve to be believed. Okay? And then they're an expert, and then it comes like there's an interview, and then you start to ask me about anything. And well, I got the mic, I might as well answer. But no, I'm not an expert on 17 different things, I'm better off saying, in my opinion, no, let's shift to other interview where you go, I just have a regular guy off the street, and I'm gonna get their opinion. If you wanna get my expert opinion, it should be on something that I'm an expert on. Okay? And I should give it in a believable way, okay? It's not just believable, but I mean, sometimes I get mad at the experts. I see them, I say, no, you don't know that. You just can't make that statement, So that's a problem. Now I say you have to believe the experts. In a sense, you have to, because you can't do it yourself. I can look at a chart of the COVID and this, but I'm not an epidemiologist. There's a lot I don't understand. When I go to the doctor says, well, what treatment do you want to follow? I'm like, you're the doctor, but it's not like you can, maybe you'll explain to me in half an hour, but you're distilling 5 years, 10 years of experience to half an hour. Glad you gave me your opinion, you explained it to me, but ultimately, I'm not the expert, and ultimately, in some sense, that's why I say I'm gonna have no choice. I have no choice for the climate. And that's why, when you tell me we had a record data point, I almost push you, but do you really believe that that's important? If I give you another data point, no, I really need the expert to tell me, no, it's not that data point. Or maybe it is that data point, I don't know. Maybe they'll tell me 41 is so incredible that it matters. I'm not an expert. So we have to believe in some sense. Nonetheless, I won't exactly go to my paper. They don't always agree. Okay, and that can make a difficulty, and that can get me to try to agree, to go to the ones I agree with and I don't. But if we can see the shift, I think, in the climate change, is there's been a big shift in the consensus among experts. 30 years ago, there was a lot more disagreement than there is now. It doesn't mean you can't find one who doesn't. But the science, the hard science, tends to move. They'll come on board, and they might polarize in the short run. They'll look at the same evidence, they go, oh, that proves my point, that proves your point, But with enough evidence, long enough, they tend to then move together, and I think that's what we're seeing with climate.
There's fewer and fewer scientists who are arguing against climate change. Sure. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily filtered into kind of the general discourse. But there's still a lot of people who will be dismissing of experts. And again, we're back to the polarization side of things, where people will be listening to someone who's not a scientist. People will go and listen to Tucker Carlson, say, not a scientist, has strong opinions on these things, and they take that on. Is there a way of kind of breaking that cycle of getting people looking towards non-experts, looking towards people who are just kind of big voices?
Yeah, so part of the problem is, as you've stated, that people say we don't believe the experts, but it's maybe they believe the wrong experts, because Tucker Carlson can sound very convincing, and sound like an expert. And they start to quote people, and they'll say something which maybe if you're watching it with your relative who disagrees, you won't be able to immediately counter it. So it's funny when people say they don't believe in experts, and I think that's in your question. The bigger problem is they're believing in the wrong experts. It's not just that they're going with their own experience, which that's one way not to believe experts, but they're just believing the wrong ones, partly because they want to, partly because they think there's a bias. So that's really the cycle that we have to break. And again, I really think the problem with climate change, COVID, are the ones where we don't have the time. I do think in a long run, climate change is moving in that direction. People have come on a lot more on board, but there's still a big resistance. But that's a question of restoring that trust. You see, sometimes that people say, oh, that comes to how can I write something that's more convincing? How can I write the next bestseller like Caldwell or something? Which uses the science, but doesn't really use it in a way that I would like, sometimes it's too imprecise, and then it gets very hard if you're reading a summary of a paper. You know what? I might tell my students, go read the paper, but it's really hard to read a paper. I can't really say it that seriously because I understand to go read a paper and to really read it, even if it's in your field, it's hard. And if it's not in your field, it's doubly hard, And then even sometimes the experts themselves, if you just read the abstract, you'll get a misleading viewpoint because in the abstract, I'm kind of trying to sell the paper and not giving you everything. So that all makes it, the experts themselves are not reliable part. So I don't want that to be but my headline, don't trust the experts. But I do want to say the experts themselves, I think, need to make sure they're reliable, not just selling what they have to say.
A part of the rational accidents thesis is about understandings of risks, like proper assessments of risk. And we've got an issue in tech in that where we as humans are really good at developing tech really quickly. And we've got a great desire to be implementing this tech and pushing it out there and making changes, making the world a better place. But with anything new, we mightn't be particularly good at it. We mightn't understand what the risks are. How can we deal with that? That's kind of that issue of technology and not understanding the risks that comes with it.
So this is a problem which goes back in time, of course, right? And we can see that with a nuclear bomb, right? And after the nuclear bombs were dropped, there were some physicists who were deeply regretful. Say, yep, I was just doing my science, and this is pure science, and whoa, that's the nuclear bomb. I didn't know that would happen, but it did. And now there's nothing that we can do about it. There's nothing that we can do about it. Now, even if they had known ahead of time, it'd be a little bit tricky because sooner or later, all the physicists would understand it, and someone else would have the nuclear bomb. So it's not just the simple question. It's there's not like the lone tech genius or the lone nuclear physicist, and all we have to do is time travel back and shoot that person, and we don't have that technology anymore. We do, and it's going to come after. So, but that's an old issue, and you're right. Tech is like getting way ahead of us, and we could say, oh, it's going to do this, it's going to do that, and it's not only that we don't understand the risk; it's like almost the risks of the risks, And again, they're non-linear; that they go too fast. So those things are very dangerous. The ones where, by the time I understand it, it's too late. By the time I understand that a car driving at 90 miles per hour is dangerous, it's not too late. Or it's too late. Some people were killed, but let's make the speed limit 70 miles an hour. That this design was dangerous. Let's fix that design, right? So there's some of those risks, which, they're dangerous, but they're kind of manageable. Let's go there. And there are others where, I didn't know the internet would do that. Wow, we have a lot of trouble, but we're not designed to stop, that kind of progress, because there's the progress, there's the downside. So I really wouldn't know what to do about that.
Okay. Yeah, because there's also the other danger of technology and us and human innovation being so powerful. We're really good at building stuff. We're really good at figuring stuff out. Is that people believe, well, don't worry about it. We'll figure it out. Just give us a few years, and we understand there's a problem now. We've got lots of smart people working on the climate issue. We'll figure it out. There's no need for us to do anything about it now, because we'll figure it out. Is that a major kind of danger for action? That just, which it seems counterintuitive, because you should have faith in humanity. We've done great things.
Well, if we go back in time again, further back in time, right? We had Malthus warning about overpopulation and the world's get too big. When the Earth's population was so much smaller, and then the story will say, well, we didn't anticipate technology. So we have. The technology has made incredible strides, and we say, we eradicated smallpox, so there are a lot. In that sense, if you say there is optimism. It's not like insane to think that it can be fixed. But on the other hand, it is insane to count on it.
Fair point, yeah. So it's there's a 30% chance of us finding something to fix out. Well, there's 70% chance, but you're just picking numbers out of the air that we won't. So
yeah, and let me flip it. Even if there's a 70% chance that we will find somebody, there's a 30% chance, even if I was going to be more optimistic, and a 30% chance we won't is huge.
Sure. Thinking about the area of polarization and how hearts and minds need to be won over a bit quicker than they are at the moment to try and get us to the point we want to be. Is there a message that you would give to kind of communicators on the climate transition? To any advice that you could give on how to break through that polarization?
I mean, if I'm going to base it on my work, not everything needs to be based on my work, okay? But if we talk in terms of novel messages or something, I mean, actually, you know what? I can go back centuries and to the French philosopher Pascal, and he said, if you want to convince somebody of something, try looking at it from their point of view, and you might see it's kind of right from their point of view. So first acknowledge that, and then give them the other point of view from which it's wrong. And maybe that's a good starting point. Then Hammer said, well, I can see, for instance, if I don't trust the scientists because I think they're all in left-wing institutions, whatever that might mean, I can see a point there. Why you might have some skepticism. I don't know, at least that's your viewpoint. So now I've understood your viewpoint. But you should look here, as you said, how much the oil companies have to play. Actually, a lot of these scientists don't. Actually, I can show you the politics of, even if generally that's their politics, this isn't, because now there's like a consensus moving, So I think acknowledging to the extent you can. So I don't want to go whole hog and say, on the one hand this, on the one hand that, everything has a point of view. Some things are just stupid and wrong, okay? So I don't want to, I can't go that far. But on the other hand, first just try to see to what extent that's true and see if that can help as well. Another issue is just, there's two kinds of denying. One is I truly don't believe it's a problem. The other is I don't want to pay that cost. Mm-hmm. They're not the same. And even if I say I might say I don't want to pay the cost, but say I don't believe it because it's just that I don't want to pay the cost. So that requires a different argument. Of course, it's easier to get you to believe it if it all's dovetailing. Okay, but also I think it's important to look at to what extent it's the costs and the technologies, to what extent, if I subsidize renewables for people who are in oil, well, that shifts the things they do as well.
Are you optimistic?
Let's say I'm hopeful rather than optimistic.
Normally ask kind of one question to everybody, which is, why should people care about what you care about, what you're passionate about? I suppose that the most appropriate question for you wouldn't be in academia. It'd be more like, why should people be passionate about, be interested in game theory or in microeconomics?
Well, I think it's because I want to look at the phenomena, the surface phenomena, and understand that if I just see people acting in a certain way, and then I might conclude, oh, you've done X, that means you want Y, because that seems to be the consequence, immediate consequence, that it doesn't necessarily mean that, okay? I have to understand the interactions of what's going on, And I could look, and you might say this is the consequence of what we all did. In a sense, that's the rational accidents, And I say, oh, I guess it means you don't really care if there's an accident, And I go, no, it doesn't mean I don't really care if there's an accident. I do. In fact, I care so much that instead of reading the memo, I was out back doing something else, which was twice as important. And then you say, well, how can that make sense? Because if no one reads the memo, okay, so now the game theory is going to put it all together, And then I'm going to understand, because we have to have better results. So we need to all get together in the company and chant, safety first, safety first, safety first. Well, is that going to work? You know, is that the problem or is that not the problem? Well, you know, maybe that has an impact. I don't want to say it has no impact, but I need to understand the game theory as well.
Well, brilliant. I think that's a very nice way to end it. So thank you so much for your time. I really, had a great conversation.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on that conversation. We hope that you enjoyed it. We hope that you learned something. If you did enjoy it, please feel free to leave a 5-star review and to subscribe to any of our channels, and we'll be sure to keep you updated on future productions. This series is produced by United Renewables in collaboration with the London Business School Alumni Energy Club.